Chapter 46, Whisper. Maybe the place didn't have quite as many floors as Harry had assumed from the building's height. It seemed Acrides was similar to the founders of Hogwarts in his love of headroom. A troll that was basically 2 adults tall had been able to comfortably fit into the school's hallways and bathrooms their first year, and even it would have felt like there was a lot of wasted space in Azkaban's layout. The hallway they entered through was probably 10 yards high and wide enough to drive a lorry through without worrying about hitting walls. The entire place was somehow getting enough light from the morning outside that they could even make out the upper reaches of the area. Yeah, it's a lot, Dawlish answered Harry's unasked question, watching the boy boggle at the high ceilings. At least they can have the Dementors float along the top so nobody working here is in danger of bumping into one of them. You must have to stay right next to the fires to keep warm, Harry complained, noticing that there were indeed braziers set up all the way along the walls of the hallway every couple of yards. Guard posts are in rooms that are a little less. Dawlish struggled for the word. Cyclopean, Dumbledore supplied absently. That, yeah, so it's not as bad in those places. But yeah, you're not wrong, the aura finished. They'd been dropped off on the pier and let through a small, heavily fortified guard post at the water line by a couple of other auras. Under the auspices of the chief warlock and a senior aura, they were allowed to keep their wands and wander on their own recognizance, but were cautioned very heavily not to give anything to the prisoners or risk a close encounter with the Dementors. They'd climbed a spiral staircase up a long ways before hitting the presumed main level. There could obviously be hidden levels of the complex between the water line and where they were now. Harry's map was basically just a very vague wireframe of the tower, with the actual passages filling in as he walked through them. There was still an immense amount of map to fill in. This cuts into the courtyard, Dawish continued explaining as they walked, gesturing at the end of the hallway, about 60 yards from where they'd entered. They had seemingly come in at one of the tower's corners. Harry could see from the map that the distance to the courtyard would be around half that if they just cut across one of the sides. But Acrides had probably wanted an impressive hallway for the first approach. There are stairs between levels, but the prison's mostly up top, and it's a climb. Out in the courtyard, they installed lifts. The entry hallways also didn't have doors on the floor level, only wall, but had them spaced along the ceiling every few yards. Harry's vague knowledge of castle siege tactics made him suspect they were basically firing positions for defenders against others invading the tower. Has anyone been up there? He asked. Yeah, just cuts up to rooms on the next level, Dawlish answered. We think they were put in to make it easier for the Dementors to get around. Surely Acrides wouldn't have installed habit trails for flying Dementors when he'd first made the place if they'd been a later accident. I think I need to see basically everything, Harry apologized, so we may be climbing a lot of stairs. It's 46 floors, Dawlish objected. Is that number important? Harry wondered. It's twice 23, Remus shrugged. To everyone's confusion, he whimsically added, F-Nord. 49 would be 7 sevens, Dumbledore mused. So maybe 3 basement levels, Harry figured, trying to locate a way down on his map. It hadn't appeared yet. What if we took the lift up and then the stairs down? Remus suggested. Certainly easier on old knees, Dawlish allowed. Harry nodded his agreement. He'd expect to find everything important lower in the building, so he wasn't sure going all the way to the top and down would be very efficient. But he did want to fill in the map. Courtyard of the tower was not exactly the kind of exciting enclosed space one might expect from the term. With the height of the surrounding tower, all being open to the sky meant was that it was able to get rained into. There might be sunlight for a short period in times of the year when the noon sun happened to be directly overhead. At least there was some fresh air, with the drizzle. Inside, the corners of the triangle were maybe 100 yards apart, and the ground was the natural rock of the island. As a testament to the power of the Dementors, and probably the rest of the dark magic suffusing the place, there weren't even hardy island plants in any of the crevices. There were a few other features in the mostly empty shadowed space. Large cisterns allowed for the collection of rainwater. A pair of magical lifts designed as basically counterweights. One would go down while the other went up, hugged one wall. And there was even a currently empty yard of mostly level terrain surrounded by fencing. Dawlish explained, The lowest security inmates get some time outside. It's more for being further from the Dementors than seeing the sky. The Aura placed his wand against a pedestal between the lifts, and the closer one began to sink toward them as the higher started to rise. Even though both were empty, they seemed to reset to somewhere in the middle, perhaps to make it harder for escapees to immediately exit onto a lift at the top floors. They really weren't much more than large slabs of painted metal of the kind that catwalks were made of, grids of steel that were more empty space than platform. Presumably, there was no good in having an exterior lift where water could puddle. Even with a tin roof and waist-high guardrails, they were still damp and had rust visible where the paint had chipped. There was space enough for all four of them, just a simple latched gate as the entrance that Dawlish opened, and then closed behind them. It was a good thing that Harry was used to heights from playing Quidditch, because as the lift started to rise, he realized there wasn't anything between him and the increasingly distant ground other than some wholly rusted metal. Remus shuffled back toward the wall of the tower as they reached the halfway mark and passed the descending sister lift, his stomach rebelling a bit at being over 100 yards in the air and still rising. "I think patronesses," Dumbledore cautioned, noticing that there were Dementors swirling in the air above them. Harry nodded, having been so busy watching the ground he'd forgotten the bigger danger. Expecto Patronum. A large chunk of his magical stamina bar immediately disappeared as he summoned his silvery canine, and his stamina regeneration rate was all but 0 as he maintained it. It had started out even worse before he got a mastery level in the spell, reducing the cost. He probably wouldn't have had enough resources to summon it at the beginning of the year. Everyone immediately felt better as the Guardian Imago began to patrol the borders of the lift, especially once the headmaster's silver phoenix joined it. A Dementor that had been drifting closer out of curiosity backed off. None of the dark magic creatures had shown up on the minimap, limiting Harry to tracking them visually. At least they weren't glitching out his interface while they kept their distance. The platform finally stopped with a slight jolt when it was level with the roofline. Harry could see that the roof was slightly canted to allow rain to run off either side. There were no crenellations for defenders, but long trenches in the center of the roof seemed like they could be used as concealed points to hold off attackers on brooms. And who knew whether there were defenses that could be transfigured in case of an actual attack? "We can go in through the trenches," Dawlish instructed, opening the other gate at the back of the lift and striding over the 1-foot gap between the platform and the roof. "Watch your step. Does it only go to the top?" Harry asked, glad that the platform at least didn't sway as he was momentarily leaping over a fall that was far enough that he could almost reach terminal velocity. He managed to maintain his footing on the perpetually water-slick roof. "Couple of other doors that we passed," the Aura shrugged. "They're annoying to get open, though." The recessed trenches had adequate drainage into gutters at either side, and stone stairs led from them down into the tower. An arch exited off to either side before descending into the main level, and once again Harry spotted the Dementor tunnels along the top of the hallway that were probably originally meant to be firing emplacements for defenders against anyone that made it down into the tower. While convenient to serve as passageways for the place's spectral guardians, he couldn't believe that was the intention. "This is maximum security," Dawlish explained as they left the stairs. The floor was once again a wide hallway with emplacements/Dementor tunnels above, but instead of bare stone there were doors along the wall. In this section of hallway they were open and clearly full of supplies, spare bedding, tins of food, and fuel for fires. But to either end, secure doorways stood, barred from their side. Mostly Death Eaters these days. "Can the Dementors cut into there through the ceiling?" Harry asked. His map was slowly filling in for this level, though beyond the doors there were only darts extending to the range he could usually sense people. They were spaced regularly, as if one to a room. Zooming in on the inmate darts, he found several names that didn't mean anything to him, though Lestrain seemed to be popular surname. He still mentally noted them for later, just in case. He wasn't sure in case of what. "Yeah," Dawlish nodded. "What if someone got smuggled a shrunken broom or something?" Harry figured. They could fly up to the ceiling, then right out off the top. "It's been tried," the Aura agreed. "We scan for that kind of thing, but there are also wards at the top level. Anything other than a Dementor tries to fly away from the tower, they get blown right back in and sucked into the courtyard. Ah, that would do it, Harry said, still looking at both the physical space and his map. It really was imposing. Whisper to Sirius Black, "We're up at your old level. How'd you even get out anyway?" They discovered the whisper function a few weeks earlier, when Harry had been trying to get Seamus to pipe down in potions class before losing them a ton of points. The intention to whisper had been translated into a direct message from the game system, identical to hearing Harry messaging the guild, at least according to the other marauders he'd subsequently tried it with. Seamus seemed a little suspicious. Overall, it was a really confusing term for a private message using the game, but useful. Hermione's best guess was that it might make sense in a video game if you were trying to speak to someone privately to whisper, but why that could be achieved at any distance was another confusing artifact of Harry's bizarre powers. Sirius Black replies, "It's intense, right? I slipped out while a Dementor was opening my cell to feed me. They didn't even notice me as Padfoot." Reply to Sirius Black, "But the main door, and the roof, and the lift, and getting out the front." Sirius Black replies, "All timing, sneakiness, and luck. It's dark in there at night. If you're quiet enough, being a black dog in the dark is as good as invisible to slip through doors behind people, and I got on the lift going down while someone was coming up." Reply to Sirius Black, "Can I tell Dawlish that to sound smart? Without mentioning Padfoot, of course." Sirius Black replies, "Sure, I'm never going back there. Never. What if someone figured out some way to become invisible to Dementors?" Harry acted like he was musing as the group had drifted toward one of the dividing doors. Could they just kind of slip out when they were getting fed, and then maybe hide in corners in the dark to wait for doors to open? The old Aura didn't shoot the idea down out of hand. He cocked his head and thought about it, eventually admitting, "I'm sure the wizards downstairs would tell you they'd never let someone just walk behind them like in one of those old cartoons." It was interesting to Harry that Dawlish knew enough about muggles to reference that. But yeah, in the dark, if someone was tired and just using their Patronus light to get around, yeah. I'll talk to some people about better protocols. Do you need to see the Death Eaters, or can we head down? Harry glanced at the headmaster, who shook his head. "I would caution against it. Who knows what plots would start to percolate through those minds should they see young Harry. If the key to our investigations lies in their cells, then we shall have to, but I'd prefer to examine anything else first." "Best thing I've heard since we got here," the Aura agreed. "Just 45 more levels to see then. Going down." Chapter 47, Farlow. Why are there so many rooms? Harry wondered, as they were a little over halfway down the tower. Most floors featured a looped hallway that ran through the center of the building, making basically a quarter of a mile trail to travel a full circuit of the level. Even just walking past at a brisk stroll and glancing around, it was taking them about 10 minutes per floor, including time to take the stairs down, or 6 per hour. They'd eventually stopped to have lunch on the 23rd floor, and Remus still found that number amusing for some reason. Harry considered, "You could almost fit every wizard and witch in Britain in here, right?" He'd narrated some of the details to the Marauders Guild channel, and Hermione had done the math for him. Each floor was probably upwards of 100,000 square feet of space, even after deducting walls and hallways. That could more than comfortably fit a couple hundred people per floor, and the number of rooms seemed to bear that out. Some floors had large, high-ceilinged suites, and others had more smaller rooms. None of them were furnished, and the Dementors and commute difficulties probably lowered the market value, but the tower would serve as a pretty spacious high-rise apartment block for several thousand people. Maybe Acrisdes was trying to outbreed the rest of the island, Remus mused. Oh, their main issue would be food production, since Gamp's laws prevent it from being conjured. They'd be reliant on importing. Dumbledore suggested. Many of these rooms seemed designed for storage. With shrinking and preservation charms, they could put in stores that would last even a full building quite some time. He didn't even comment on the idea that, if the Dark Wizard had his way, presumably many of the denizens would have the game system to allow them to preserve food indefinitely in their inventories. Pretty common tactic to raid the countryside for supplies back in those days, Dawlish agreed. With the defenses on this place, it would have been hard to find them, much less roust out the society of dark wizard Vikings raiding all of Europe. He nodded grimly. Probably best the old wanker mysteriously keeled over. Lot of dark wizards have big plans and then get sidetracked by pants-on-head madness and schemes. And the ministry hasn't thought about making use of all this space. Remus asked. It was the headmaster that explained. It's been discussed in the Wisengamot as a possible fallback position if the worst happens, the statute of secrecy is broken, and the Muggles begin their witch hunts again. But would you wish to live here, given any other option? I don't really want to be here now, Dawlish chuckled. At least we're almost to the bit we can skip. Block of 3 floors that the stairs just go past coming up. That doesn't seem suspicious, Harry asked. The old Aura shrugged, admitting, not a lot of curiosity to go around about this place. Most figure it's just where the Dementors live. Harry didn't think that seemed likely, and sure enough, as they passed the first landing with no door out, where one usually was, he saw a glyph on the map, similar to the last time he'd been into a dungeon way back at the burrow. I think there's a secret door here, he explained to the group. He moved up to the wall and peered at the map, hoping it would show the way to open the door the way it did at Hogwarts. Before giving up the secret, a prompt appeared. You must gather your party before venturing forth, that about figured. It was time to get Dawlish into the party, apparently. He made Dumbledore party leader, then messaged him. Whisper to Albus Dumbledore, Dawlish needs to be in the party before we can open it. The old man gave an amused smile and said, Well, John, I think we're moving from tour to exploration, if Harry can guess how to get this door open. Do you intend to be party to our bit of amateur archaeology? If you can get it open, I'll have your backs, the Auror agreed, and his name and statistic bars joined Harry's list. With that, the password appeared on the map, and Harry's conversational Latin was high enough for him to go, Well, that's ominous. Before anyone could ask what was ominous, he went ahead and said, Finis universi carnis venit coram me. Kid speaks Latin. Dawlish boggled, as the bricks of the wall began to slide open, similarly to the secret passage into Diagon Alley. The end of all flesh is come before me, Dumbledore translated. He couldn't help giving an impromptu history lesson, explaining, at least that's the King James translation, which was produced over a century after this tower was built. I don't believe there were any English translations at the time, so the quote comes from the older Latin Bibles. The newer versions phrase it something more like, I am going to put an end to all people. It's part of Genesis chapter 6, if I'm not mistaken, from the story of Noah's Ark. Yeah, I agree with Potter. That's ominous, Dawlish said. Are we entering into a horror story? Remus frowned. As the door slid all the way open into darkness, Dumbledore shrugged and helpfully tossed off a few floating orbs of warm golden light to begin sailing ahead. The hallway seemed very similar to the ones on the upper floors, for all that it wasn't lit, except by the conjured magical lamps. All 4 had their wands ready as they stepped in, but other than the lack of pre-installed magical torches, the hallway didn't seem very different than any of the others they'd traveled down. The level was one with ceilings of middling height, only about 15 feet. Like most of the other floors, doors extended off to either side at regular intervals, presumably for various rooms and suites. It doesn't look like Dementors stay here, Harry said, though he'd expected as much. Secret bedrooms, Dawlish asked. There are the outlines of windows on the exterior, but they're all shut up. Everyone figured they were decorative. How hard did they try to transfigure them open? Remus suggested, I think we should check one. No one disagreed, so he went ahead and tested the first door on his right with a few detection spells before using a simple Alohomora to make it click open. There was a locking charm, but it had deteriorated, he explained. This one's furnished, Harry explained, his young eyes adjusting faster to the dark room than the others. Sure enough, as the headmaster caused one of his floating lanterns to drift in, it revealed something that seemed to just be a bedroom in a 15th century style. An ornate cedar wardrobe, an oak dresser with inset wash basin, a small bookshelf, a chair and writing desk, and a 4-poster bed filled most of the space. Preserving charms, he wondered, since it had survived the damp tower for 5 centuries. Dumbledore did his own detecting charms and said, quite faded, were there any to begin with? It is a mystery that none of this has decayed. Nothing to make it decay, Remus figured. They turned to look at him and he explained, Between the dark magic and the Dementors, nothing seems to grow here. How long would it take something to rot if it was sealed in a space with no rats, no bugs, not even any fungus? This place may be a perfect time capsule, especially since it was sealed enough that it doesn't feel very humid in here. I wonder if they used magic to open and close the windows, Harry said, having walked over to a square of the wall that was clearly set up as an exterior window with a sill and everything. Best not to try until this has all been catalogued, Dumbledore suggested, having gravitated to the small bookshelf. If these have become brittle, a change in moisture in the room could result in them falling apart. I fear to even leaf through them until conservators have inspected them. And they may be full of traps and dark magic, Remus warned. That as well, the headmaster agreed, sadly. His fingers still lingered a few inches from the books, as if longing to see whether they represented new material for the Hogwarts library. Given Harry's difficulty finding books from the period that referenced Echrisdes, he realized that even in wizarding society, a trove of 500-year-old books could represent a massive amount of lost information. Changing gears, Dumbledore said, if we find more rooms like this, we can assume that this level was where Echrisdes' apprentices resided. We know from the journals that he was recruiting several scions of local families to join him here. Sure enough, the other rooms were configured similarly. The Dark Wizard had seemingly had even more apprentices than Sagittarius Black had surmised, as the level was far from empty. Perhaps 50 wizards and witches had called the floor home, and their effects would be a boon to scholars. Each was empty, but seemed lived in. Some beds were made with various levels of effort, while others had their sheets mussed as if the resident had not bothered to move them after getting up. Chairs were pulled from desks like someone had just gotten up. Toiletries were placed quick to hand around wash basins, and drawers were often partway open. Each room looked like the resident had left for the day, but planned to come back soon, and no one had come behind to neaten up. Guess they didn't have house elves, Dawlish figured, after a room that had housed someone that was probably a slob, given the lived-in disarray. Given the level of secrecy and the participation of secondary children, Dumbledore mused, they likely had none to call upon. Particularly in those days, a family's bonded elves going missing might have raised more suspicion than the loss of a non-inheriting child. They may have brought human servants, however, Remus suggested. I think employing muggles for that kind of thing was more common back then, and I can't imagine a few dozen wealthy young wizards doing all the cooking and cleaning themselves. The headmaster shrugged. In formal apprenticeship, it used to be more common to demand such services of the students. Many hands may have made light work. There are still more levels, Harry figured. Let's see if we find rooms for servants. In addition to the apprentice suites, that level had some rooms that were clearly storage for things like linens, as well as bathing chambers that were little more than spaces for tubs. The ability to use magic to create water and remove waste certainly reduced the complexities of such bathrooms, and also explained why wizarding society felt so superior to muggles. Genuinely had been able to rely upon creature comforts beyond the ken of mundane society hundreds of years earlier. Centered along each of the faces of the tower was another stairway that went down a single level, linking the floor they'd entered to the one below without needing to use the tower's corner stairways or the secret passages. The level seemed to be mixed use, appointed with places that appeared to be kitchens, dining rooms, studies, practice spaces, and even rooms marked out for rituals. To Harry's suggestion, near the kitchens there were smaller, less nice rooms that were likely quarters for servants. Well, I'll be. Basically a whole mini Hogwarts hidden in here, Dawlish admitted, when they were mostly done exploring the level. And one more floor below that's also hidden. I wonder what they did there. They eventually found the way down in a concealed stairway in the middle of the block of ritual rooms that might have otherwise seemed like a materials closet if the explorer didn't have Harry's map. With Remus in front and Dawlish right behind, Harry was pretty sure that he could answer that question before he even set foot on the floor, since his quest finally updated. The Prisoner of Azkaban, main quest. A secret from your past has escaped. Get to Hogwarts, learn about the crimes of Sirius Black *, learn about Dementors, learn more about Echrisdes, investigate Azkaban, for what Echrisdes left behind. Defeat the Guardians. Descend to the basement laboratory. as Dumbledore sent more floating lanterns out. It became obvious that the entire floor was as empty as possible, with the sprawling space only broken up by simple, square, load-bearing columns. Stone ceilings, floors, and walls disappeared into the distance as over 2 acres of tower space opened without obstruction, wrapping around the walls of the interior courtyard, and humanoid figures began to shamble out of the shadows toward them, each a red dot on Harry's map. There were dozens of them. Chapter 48, Bind. The names of the zombie horde made it pretty clear what he was dealing with. Deteriorating inferious undead, level 3 well. Harry had been correct that the Guardians would be about the right level for him. He wasn't sure what level a new inferior should be, but these had clearly diminished down to the level of his third-year main quest after centuries posted up in Azkaban. Unfortunately, that didn't account for the sheer number of the creatures. The swarm of red dots popping in from the edges of his map was hard to count in the zombie apocalypse moment of horror, but it was probably dozens, maybe 100, and he'd never know whether that number would have been a lot fewer if he'd come here without a bunch of much higher-level helpers. It couldn't, right? It just wouldn't make sense for the world to retroactively change the number of zombies that Acrisdes had created 5 centuries earlier to provide an appropriate challenge for an archmage, a defense teacher, an aura, and the boy who lived. Right. The Inferi were slightly mummified, their clothing of an ancient make, but still holding up like all the other furnishings in the nearby levels. They were almost entirely adult men of nearby European stock, wearing garb that seemed vaguely nautical, for all that styles had changed since the 1400s. It was an easy bet that these were the remains of the sailors that had disappeared into Azkaban over the years. Bubblehead charms, Remus realized, as everyone began to ready their fire-making incantations. Fortunately, he considered the possibility that a lot of fire thrown around in an enclosed space could have ramifications for the amount of oxygen available, and taught Harry the spell in passing. Each of the men wrapped their heads in a somewhat silly-looking globe of air, and then began to cast at the shambling horde. Harry was just glad that he'd gotten dispensation to cast spells in Azkaban, for all that the Trace probably wouldn't notice him there for a whole list of reasons, even without instancing. Harry's screams of incendio managed to launch accurate gouts of flame to ignite nearby undead. Remus and Dawlish were also peppering in a few shouts of confringo between their own fire-making charms, and the blasting curse was highly effective at exploding zombies in flaming bursts. Harry hadn't quite gotten his head wrapped around that spell, but it seemed worth learning. Both defense professors' magical stamina bars dipped visibly each time they cast it, so it was clearly not an all-the-time spell. Dumbledore had backed up to let them handle the first wave as he worked up to something ridiculously powerful. Harry could see his magical stamina dipping as he wove a complex conjuring. A few moments later his wand lashed out, crimson and gold flames spilling out of it and circling them in a ring of intense fire, the heat directed outward. "Move forward," the headmaster suggested simply, as the Inferi started to balk and retreat in the face of so much fire magic. Harry was really glad of the charm allowing him to breathe clean air, as the immense room very quickly filled with the smoke of charred zombies as they strode through the space, igniting every creature they could see. Each of the Inferi shattered into flaming debris and dust as their hit point bars emptied, the smoke of their passage incredibly foul-looking. Within a few minutes, they were basically just hunting down stragglers, and Dumbledore didn't even bother to maintain the defensive wall of fire, instead launching his own gouts of flame. His fire-making charms were like a welding torch, a bright white lance of flame slicing deep into the undead. While everyone's magical stamina was low after the last Inferius fell, none had gotten close to laying a withered hand on them. 766 Combat XP earned Owl Combat Magic XP, earned Owl Charms XP earned. That was a lot of XP. But given that just beating a level 3 student in a duel was worth 45, it seemed like mowing through 100 Inferi should have been worth over 1,000. He must be getting some kind of penalty for being the lowest level member of the party, particularly with more than a level difference like he usually had with the other marauders. Though it was probably fair, he definitely hadn't done a quarter of the work. The headmaster waved his wand a few times, using wind charms and some kind of advanced cleansing spells to disperse the smoke and restore oxygen to the area. In a minute, all that was left of the fight was the piles of two black ash vaguely in the shape of bodies. In places where they'd destroyed several together, it wasn't even recognizable as more than a carpet of soot. Remus tentatively dismissed his bubble head charm and took a guarded breath, then nodded to the others. Doesn't smell great, but it should be safe to breathe. Such a tragedy, Dumbledore said, regarding the destroyed undead. Kidnapped, experimented on, and then made into such mockeries, all for nothing. Harry blinked, just suspicious enough of the old man after the last year to wonder if he'd have been less disapproving if Acrisdes had more success. They must have been guarding something, was all he said, however. Maybe a basement laboratory. The prisoner of Azkaban main quest, a secret from your past, has escaped. Get to Hogwarts, learn about the crimes of Sirius Black *, learn about Dementors, learn more about Acrisdes, investigate Azkaban for what Acrisdes left behind, defeat the Guardians, descend to the basement laboratory, learn the goals of Acrisdes. The stairs down were hard to miss, once they walked to the far side of the floor. A spiral staircase stood near the courtyard wall, wide enough that all of them could walk side by side. It was even shallow enough that it would have been ideal for carrying down equipment, perhaps. As Harry glanced down at it, it spiraled down on his map, seeming to go on all the way down to the base of the tower. I know now that we should have been more curious, Dawlish observed, but there's no way we'd have missed a hidden staircase this large punching through the rest of the building. Space expansion, Remus figured. Might be narrow enough from outside to just seem like a ventilation shaft or load-bearing column between rooms. Harry nodded as they began to descend through unspoken agreement. The map of the lower levels was doing some weird stretching the way it had other times he'd been inside a building or room that was bigger than it was supposed to be. If he completed the map of the lower levels, he was sure it would, indeed, have a barely noticeable shaft where the large stairway should be. I guess this is one way to keep us from figuring out how to get to the basement, Dawlish grumbled after they'd already descended a dozen floors. Clearly Acrisdes did not wish for visitors, Dumbledore agreed. But with the connection directly to the hidden living area of his followers, likely there was a way past the Inferi. Perhaps it needed his presence, or some kind of. Whatever speculation, the old man was about to make about how the Dark Wizard's apprentices might have bypassed the zombies was lost, as their lights played across the first of the bodies. Little more than a mummy, the figure was still identifiable as a light-haired man in linen robes. Just as none of their furniture had been subject to bugs and microorganisms, 5 centuries had seemingly just been enough for the apprentice to desiccate. His head was facing them, his body face up, as if he'd been descending the stairs and falling backwards, or been running up the stairs only to turn to face an attacker. Killing curse, Remus wondered. I don't see a mark on him. Dawlish shook his head and explained, I've seen that pose before, Dementor's kiss. There's a way they curl up to try to protect themselves before they go limp. If anyone in the Aura department wasn't disturbed by the worst method of capital punishment in Britain, they would tend to find themselves quietly moved to another department. The Dementor's kiss was legal for the worst crimes. That didn't mean it was good. Shedding his normally affable mien, Dumbledore looked every one of his 111 years. His brain had jumped to the idea that, if Acrisdes accidentally created Dementors, and none of his people were prepared. This will not be the first body we find. Harry, I'm okay, sir. Harry allowed the old man to abandon his attempt to talk him into staying behind. After all, Dumbledore knew they probably needed him to see the quest through, regardless of the effect it would have on his childish sensibilities. Hopefully, Harry's mental fortress would prove up to the task of preventing the nightmares. We'll get them on the way out, Dawlish decided. Probably a lot of families who'd like to finally put a body in the tombs of their family members what went missing all those years ago. And they, indeed, found more as they descended, each in a similar pose. Perhaps a dozen had made it to the stairs. Given the number of bedrooms upstairs, they expected to find even more beneath. As Harry's map suggested they were now about a dozen yards beneath the entry level, the stairs finally opened up into a room. It was smaller than the rest of the width of the tower, mostly taking up the space beneath the courtyard. Uneven fog at the periphery suggested to Harry that there might be hidden rooms filling the rest of the footprint around them, but they'd exited onto a room nearly the size of a Quidditch pitch. A cleverly vaulted ceiling reached up to keep the courtyard from crashing down into the room without the use of columns. And within, an immense ritual circle was carved into the stone of the floor. There were so many rings, none of them a precise circle, but instead tracing unusual parabolas that itched at Harry's mostly untapped skill at arithmancy. Along each, countless runes, gems, and precious metals had been embedded into the floor. As the headmasters conjured lamps spread out to light the space, they tried not to pay too much attention to all the Dementor-kissed mummies cowering around the edges of the room. 7 significant rings, Dumbledore observed almost instantly, discounting the binding and balancing circles within the diagram. If I'm not mistaken, each has 7 focal points. 49 apprentices, Remus realized. Not 50, 7 sets of 7, just like the number of floors. He began this ritual as soon as he had enough apprentices to do it. And the master himself in the center, the headmaster nodded. Perhaps they used this for many great rituals. But my intuition is that they used it once, and it went badly wrong. Dawlish, not nearly as academic as the 2 other adults in the room, was simply muttering to himself as he tried to count the bodies. No statute of limitations on murder. I don't think this is the laboratory, Harry noted, realizing his quest hadn't checked off. He'd stayed well clear of the outer ring of the oversized ritual circle and the bodies, but had managed to map most of the room as he walked around the circumference. There are some stairs down over here, and I think there might be a tunnel out over there. Unsurprisingly, the 2 other exits from the room were at the center of the other sides of the tower's interior triangle. What direction's the tunnel out? Dawlish asked, interested. Harry pointed. Basically northeast, I think, far side of the tower from home. The Auror nodded. We've seen Dementors coming and going from near the water down that side, but nobody could ever find a tunnel. Must be hidden by a powerful illusion on the outside. What were they even trying to do here? Remus asked, fascinated by the complex circle. This is beyond my understanding of arithmancy, but I'm seeing a lot of rune clusters common in dark arts. I would require much longer to examine it to be truly sure, Dumbledore admitted. But if I may make an educated guess, I'd suspect this was about passing some unique capability Acrisdes possessed to his apprentices. And it may have had unintended consequences. Remus and Harry nodded. The headmaster had been read in on the idea that Acrisdes had been trying to give the game system to his apprentices. It made sense. Dawlish barely seemed to notice the conspiratorial agreement among the other 3. I think I had a several greats aunt go missing in the 15th century. Wonder if she's here somewhere. More bodies in the tunnel, Harry frowned, having drifted over to the presumed exit. It's like they were trying to get out any way they could. Dumbledore asked a seeming non sequitur, his voice audible even in the giant room due to the lack of other noise and excellent acoustics. How many Dementors would you say there are in Britain, John? Well, it's hard to get an exact count, since they look so similar, and they come and go from the insides of the tower as they please, the Auror mused. But if I recall correctly based on the number that were tasked to me for Black, and the number that needed to be held in reserve at the tower, the general theory is that there can't really be much more than a few dozen. Before he could ask why the old man was asking, he finally got it. Yeah, there might well be around 49 of the Blighters. Are you thinking? That Acrisdes accidentally caused his apprentices to become, or at least release, Dementors upon their demise. Yes, Dumbledore said. Unless something else bears investigation. Then I suppose there are now only the stairs down. Reconvening at the stairway, the 4 shared a glance and resumed their normal formation, the defense instructors in the front to protect the headmaster and the boy, who lived as they walked down the less elaborate staircase. It was a simple structure like the stairs elsewhere in the tower, just wide enough to move larger magical equipment down a floor. As Dumbledore's floating magical lights spread across the second basement, there were cries from each of them of expecto patronum. For sure enough, the floor seemed a little more broken up into various laboratories, but there were Dementors clearly visible from the exit of the stairwell. The 3 creatures, black robes to everyone but Harry, who saw the shimmer of broken user interface, seemed to have posted up around a segment of the floor that was lit by its own blue glow. A subsection of the level was warded, a perpetual barrier that kept the Dementors from approaching the figure within. Perhaps they had been waiting there for 5 centuries, hoping that the ward would fail and allow them access to their creator. Because even though his user interface was flickering slightly in the presence of the Dementors, Harry could still see the floating name and details of the figure protected and trapped within the wards. Ecrisdes of Lamialik, level 20+, children of the Ark Master,